Hello and welcome to our November Digital Disruption mini podcast hosted by Novus Strategy. I'm Pete Gatenby and I'm joined here today by Alastair Thornton, Director of Growth at Yopa. Thanks for being with us, Alistair. Great to have you. You've written a great piece for our latest newsletter unpacking the role of proof of concept or POCs or POCs, depending how you say it, in change initiatives, particularly within the estate agency space of the home buying journey. Before we dive into that though, can you give our audience a quick overview of your role at Yopa and what drew you into exploring the POC approach in our newsletter?
Yeah, so at Yopa, I look after a number of things. So most technology, both on the internal IT side and the engineering side. I look after product, marketing, elements of strategy and the data teams. Cool. So yeah, certainly quite a wide remit. Why proof of concepts? So, and there's two things, right? We all know that the market is pretty complicated for estate agents. You know, the number of actors, you've got obviously the buyers and sellers themselves, you've got conveyancers, agents, you've got brokers, lenders, surveyors, one for each side, and then arguably through chains, so you've got ×2 to the power of X, and lots of moving parts. So small impacts can easily be magnified and amplified to major issues. So there's a risk there on any change. Also, when I look at a lot of what we're doing, it's around AI. And while AI is great, it's also very, very new. So historically, when you look at business cases, there's some sort of element of precedence or grounding, which you can say, if I do this, the result is likely to be X, Y, or Z. With AI, you can't do that. So it doubles the risk. So it's very much, okay, what can we prove up front before we put it live and really start having, testing this stuff in anger.
Cool. Do you think it's critical then when you're looking at products you're going to either deploy internally or deploy to the market from a customer standpoint? Do you see it as being a critical part of that process, or are there times when you perhaps just dive straight to full product development and full deployment?
It's as the case fits. So if it's a simple change, or it's a change where we've made similar changes in the past and therefore can predict with some degree of accuracy, or where the risk is minimal, then there's no point of doing proof of concepts. Likewise, if it's cheap and fairly efficient to get something live and you're going to learn that way, then do it. So that your MVPs are perfect, pilots are perfect. If it's a big risk and it's unknown, then I would always try and lean into the proof of concepts.
Yeah, of course. You open your article by talking about the sheer complexity of the property ecosystem, multiple moving parts, dependencies, and lots of independent actors, and how even small changes can disrupt that whole system, especially downstream, because obviously estate agents are often upstream, they're involved all the way through the process, right? But typically first engagement with the customer. Why do you think that the complexities have made innovation so challenging in property, and how might AI be helped to reduce some of that friction?
So I think the difficulty with innovation, particularly within our element of the part of the journey, is obviously there's lots of rules, there's lots of regulation, there's lots of moving parts. You can only influence so much of it. And therefore, when you start to get to bigger investments, it becomes a challenge of, well, I can do that, but is that really going to impact and improve everything enough to actually make a material difference? Because we talked before, we only control one small part of the chain, one small part of the transaction. If it breaks down at any point, we all lose out, no matter how much investment we've put into certain areas of that. So that's really the challenge for us. You can innovate, but actually we don't have full control of the journey, and all of us within that journey sit on the regulation, the red tape, and all those sort of things, which also limit the potential impact. So you've got to be very targeted at what you invest in.
Yeah, and so when we look at AI, then how can that help to reduce some of that friction?
But I think there's a number of things. I mean, a lot of what we're looking at for AI is how can we speed things up, or how can we make predictions. I mean, a very good example is with fall throughs. A proportion of the fall throughs, and it's very difficult to quantify exactly how many, is because of mortgage down valuations, and that could become a bigger thing as the market gets tougher. In an ideal world, of course, we'd like to be able to say, well, okay, if the mortgage companies could actually give us access to their AVM tools up front, we'd be able to say, okay, we know exactly what's going to be lent, or at least near as damn it, and therefore you then say, okay, this is going to be a good transaction. One of the things we're looking at AI is, can we actually predict what the mortgage company would be willing to lend on, even though they won't give us access to that information? And if we can eliminate some of the fall throughs from that, then that's a good step forward. And we can then do some interesting things around packaging that up and productizing it for the customer. A lot of the other parts of AI is just speeding up that communication. Some of the tools around AI agents, the ability to phone solicitors to get an update, for example, or phone the customer, or do things very, very quickly or in parallel, means that actually we can just shrink some of those steps very, very slightly, reduce the amount of time it takes to get a transaction through, and therefore less time for people's life situations to change and then walk away, or for them to just change their mind.
That's it. No, I agree with you. And you touched on a really interesting point at the beginning of that answer, which was around how fragmented at the moment the technology is fragmented between estate agents and the lender. Do you see that POCs could perhaps help us test and prove how those systems could actually work together? So we'll talk about your systems, you use the example of AVMs, but how we could potentially test those systems together, and how data passing cleanly between the platform or even the customer handoffs, to use a different example, could begin to be seamless and start to prove that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key is about making sure it is the right data or the right integrations. I mean, we spoke before around some of the material information is being able to share the fact that it's got parking or broadband speed is irrelevant, right? The houses aren't falling through because of that. But if you can share the mortgage valuation, or you can share search data, or you can share the AML data, then that becomes more effective. For two reasons. One, if it's shared, you don't have to do it twice, it's shorter the time frame. But also, if you can make it cheaper by actually reusing it, then actually it becomes easier to put in up front, rather because the big challenge, right? We'd all love search data up front, we'd all love survey data up front, as we have in the Scottish market. But the only reason it happens in the Scottish market is it's mandated, and therefore people have to pay that money. It's very difficult to get people to pay for it if they don't have to. But if you can get it quick enough and you can get it cheap enough, or use AI just to approximate it, then actually there may be an opportunity irrespective of government regulation.
You described POCs in your article in a really cool way. I really liked this as confidence engines that can either raise or lower belief in an idea's viability. You then touched on another really interesting point in your last comment, which brings to mind HDI and the context of HDI and how that data spine runs through the process. If we tie the two things together, what I start to feel from an AI standpoint is that there's AI-driven POCs that can use simulated or synthesized data that can start to test that data plane, and so we can start to see how, if data can flow through the process, we can then start to test what the viability of AI throughout the process and from a HDI standpoint, and help bring parties together. I'm really interested from your vantage point within the estate agent space, especially being up front and being so close to the conversation around material information, and feeling the pain when you speak to customers and things changing as they go through the process, how that could safely be brought together.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one because it depends on what data we're talking about, particularly in terms of proof of concepts and HDI. So actually just picking up data and moving it through and sharing it is reasonably easy. You don't really need proof of concepts for that. It's just technical, it'll work or it won't. And the interesting thing with synthetic data, particularly if you combine it with things like synthetic personas, which is becoming a bigger thing, is actually if you can stub or approximate the data using AI, pass it through, and then almost you then question at the end is, if you had that information at this point, would it make it more or less likely that you'd be willing to commit to that purchase? Then I think that then becomes pretty powerful, because that then comes back to what we were talking about a minute ago, which is if I pass parking data through, or if I pass broadband data through, it's probably going to be irrelevant, we know that. But there is other types of data which is going to be a 50-50 call, and you can actually use the AI, you can use the synthetic data and actually prove that point. Is it worth working on that data?
And look, you probe another really interesting thought, because there's a lot of initiatives going on in the space at the moment, right, about data standards. And one of the big thing around data standards is you need to define what those standards are. Now, there's lots of different parties kind of pushing that forward in their own ways. Some are large groups are coming together, others private organizations pushing perhaps their own agenda, but also pushing ideas. But everyone, and you said it earlier as part of this conversation, that any standard that might need to take a hold is going to have to be mandated. But how do we know what data should be part of that standard if we're not able to test it? Because it's like a chicken and egg scenario in my mind. But actually, you bring up a really, really interesting point, that if we can use synthesized data, start to map the scenarios, such as the standards that may or may not be mandated, and what that material information might actually be at the outset of the process. If we can synthesize that data and therefore build synthesized personas to interrogate and ask those questions, suddenly we've got a really nice way to try and validate and use AI to try and validate some of those conversations that are ongoing at the moment. And that's really interesting as a concept, and something that perhaps the industry should be exploring a little bit further. Are you guys doing anything of that advanced nature in terms of your day-to-day work and your work with Yopa?
Not on the HDI side. I mean, interesting that the first major POC that we did with AI was really just around testing voice, and particularly the ability to cross-sell, to upsell, and have real detailed conversations with users. And obviously we could map it out and say, well, okay, if we use 11 labs, if we use X, Y, or Z LLMs, we can get a pretty good conversation where we can say it will speak in the way we want it to speak, it will follow our call tracks, it will say the right things, it will stick within the guidelines. The element that is unknown there, though, is if you're a person talking to that agent, are you going to act differently? So that's the bit you're missing. It's the human to AI interaction is different to human interaction, and very difficult to test. We created another LLM. Well, we didn't create the LLM, we used another LLM to actually act as a person, listen to that call, and say, how did you feel about that call? Now, it's not perfect.
Iterate the test.
So, but it gives you a little bit more information. And then it comes back to POCs. We can't prove that this is going to work, but we can just make it a little bit less risky and give ourselves more confidence to be able to push forward to the next step.
That's a really interesting way of doing it. And I'll tell you what's, and hats off to you guys, because one of the things that we're seeing a lot at the moment is the stage gates to unlock budget from AI POCs. The AI POCs are not hitting them because the time, the investment cost, the tokenization cost, everything else, it costs amount, and therefore they're not unlocking the budget to be taken any further than POC. And one of the things that we're trying to help people understand is, well, look, AI is a capability, like digital is, like anything is within organizations. Yeah, of course, AI does fall within digital, but actually at the moment, en masse, organizations in our industry, the maturity around AI is quite low, and therefore their ability to adopt AI at scale, either within customer-facing products or internally within their own working practices and working tools, is actually much harder. But what you're demonstrating is an increased maturity to and almost get the business kind of used to it, and the ability to just use it day to day, not even in how you're even testing things, right? And even testing AI, using AI to train and develop the AI tool in itself. And I'd argue that's giving you a massive competitive advantage, because across the industry, typically most people are going, how do I use AI? And then they're running a POC going, oh, that's expensive, and then that's where it stops. Versus sort of using POCs to increase the AI capability within the organization themselves, to almost get the organization to, and the people within the organization, used to the idea of AI being around them, sitting around them, getting the testing it with customers, testing it and getting the customers used to it, getting products, and almost begin to evolve it that way. So I think that's a really interesting and really kind of good way of doing it. So you just kind of increasing that capability all the time. And it brings me on to the next point, which is there is a commercial story here too, right? That in the conversation we've been having around HDI and the impact it's having across the ecosystem and AI, we keep coming back to that trust and evidence. POCs build both, right? We've talked about internal capabilities, build trust in the technology, but also within the market space as well. And from a product standpoint, it builds trust in the technology being deployed into live environment or even deployed internally. Beyond risk reduction though, what's the growth upside of using AI to run POCs well, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think ultimately it always comes back to risk. It's everything we do in terms of business cases around risk and return. So it's either risk of what will go wrong or a risk of will we make money if we do this. I think the thing that we have to accept is that with AI and with the speed of change beyond AI in the environment at the moment, is projects are riskier than they've ever been. They're less certain because there's more options, more vectors and everything else. So we have to accept that those projects are going to be riskier. So the POCs, even on revenue increasing projects, is really about how close to a decent level of confidence can we get. And that probably also comes alongside, you've got to change your risk premium in your return on investment calculations, because it is going to be riskier than it has been in the past. So your weighted average cost of capital, you put your risk premium on, that's going to be a bigger jump, and therefore you need to be more certain to justify it. And the other thing in terms of the risk element and the revenue element is we've almost changed the way we're doing business cases from this is so new we can't be certain. So within that business case is what's the worst thing that can happen? What's the worst case scenario? How much are we actually risking by doing this? So if this is a £250,000 project, actually, even if it goes disastrously wrong, we know that we can still get X% back, just because some elements of it are going to be more certain. And therefore, would we be willing to spend that money just to learn and build new capabilities in the business? And you almost use it as a learning exercise as well as a project in its own right.
Yeah, it goes back to that capability thing, right?
Yeah.
Increasing the capability, and that's the return on investment.
Yeah.
Cool. No, I think you make some really good points that a lot of people who listen to this can probably take that away, because if we can increase if the return on investment is purely binary in the old way of PLCs used to be, then AI is hard to get that, especially right now because of how expensive it is, right? But on the flip side, if you can develop the capability and that's your return on investment, then there's real dividends to that, especially as AI continues to accelerate. If we think about the future of horizontal digital integration now and the next phase of the transformation that we're seeing unfolding across the market at the moment, where system processes, data increasingly need to work as one, what role do you see POCs playing in making that possible across the industry?
I think at each individual step, there's going to be risky elements which you can test. Proof of concepts works perfectly fine. I think the interesting thing is going to be multiple of those actors getting together to run shared proof of concepts. So getting the lenders in the room with the conveyancers, in the room with the estate agents, all the way back to AML, and say, actually, what proof of concept can we put in place and test this? And does that start with a lender saying, well, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up our AVM. Let's test how that works and push it all the way through, either in the real world or with those synthetic personas, and let's see what happens.
Who do you think owns that? Who should own that as an initiative?
Well, I don't think any one player owns it. I mean, it needs somebody to step up and say, let's do this and get everybody in the room and start coordinating them. But I think by definition, it needs everybody to be bought in and working together. If one individual element owns it, then actually, why would you put the AVM into that pot and all the rest of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the tough bit for me, is getting everyone around the table to have those conversations at that level. That's definitely where we're seeing the biggest people and we're working change with across the industry. For an estate agency then, anyone who might be listening right now, what's one kind of small practical first step that they can take away when they're starting to apply the POC methodology and starting to think about how that might work within their business? What's your advice for them?
So I think, if we look at AI, which is probably where most of that uncertainty and most of that growth is going to come from, is you're right with what you said earlier, that AI is expensive or can be expensive, but actually running the proof of concepts isn't necessarily that expensive. Like, we all have access to ChatGPT, to Gemini. There's a lot of stuff that you can do to almost stub out some of those processes and get a good idea of, will this work, won't this work? And you daisy chain a lot of these things together, and you can have a pretty good proof of concept for pretty much any part of your business. So I say, start small, don't invest too much. Each step of that proof of concept gives you a little bit more confidence, opens up a little bit more investment, and you can just keep going until you feel that you're at that level, which is, okay, now the upside is worth the risk. But it's going to be, I think, more of a portfolio approach, which is, we're going to try 3 or 4 things. A couple of them will work, a couple of them won't, but the upside of the ones that work will more than offset the ones that don't. And it's that shift of thought, rather than every project has to be successful, which is the new way of thinking in my book.
No, I agree. Thank you, Alistair. That was really, really interesting. I appreciate that. Do you have any final comments before we wrap up?
No, I think the only thing I'd say is, proof of concepts do work. They do de-risk things, and we should all be using them and using them more.
I agree. Thank you, Alistair, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us in this month's edition of the Digital Disruption podcast. Myself, Pete Gatenby, and special guest this month, Alastair Thornton. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.